Great. Yeah, so today I am going to be talking about figuring out this getting the balance right in this hybrid model that a lot of us find ourselves working in, where we use remote work as a thing we do, and there's offices involved, and getting the interplay between the two of those right. And so the talk's called Remote-ish. I think, you know, I've already explained a little bit of my story, but before I got into product, I was actually in advertising. I started out better part of the first decade of working. I was working in advertising as a writer specifically, and got really interested in digital work, and then started my own digital marketing agency. And very quickly started really enjoying the work where we were building things, and we found ourselves building tools to solve problems instead of doing marketing sites. That kind of led into this journey into product. And I've been working in product either as a product design space, product strategy space, or product management space for almost a decade now. Currently, I'm the director of product at Over. And you know, as we've been speaking, I've been remote-ish for quite some time now. And so the topic that I'm talking about today is something that I've definitely experienced in a few companies, in a few different types of how would you call it, industries, or yeah, industries is a good way of explaining it. So I've done this in a business I owned that was a digital product agency. We built digital products for clients. I've done this in a financial services company for a large insurer in Africa. And we've been doing this at Over since right in the beginning since the beginning of Over's journey. So that's a little bit about me. At Over, which is where I've been for the last year, and I've worked there previously before as well, we build simple tools to help people build their brand. And we've been going as a design tool since 2012. We are on iOS, Android, and soon coming to web. Most of our user base is iOS, and we're one of the first. We're really early into the space of mobile design. While we are a US company, we have offices in both the UK and South Africa, that's SA. And we also have a large number of remote workers who are scattered across Europe, India. We have Americans working from America. We have Americans working from South Africa. Yeah, so we are really kind of everywhere, pretty much. And so this is something that's been very real for us as well, and it's certainly become more real as we've gotten bigger. So a lot of what I'm sharing here will be a combination of just my life experience and our experience at Over more recently. Speaking of remotes, I mean, like, you know, I think it would be fair to say that at the moment the world is remote curious. You know, although I saw a tweet this morning that said something to the effect of only 3% of America's workforce is actually working remotely. Despite that, you know, 67% of US companies are actually like working remote or have implemented remote working in some kind of way, shape, or form. That was a 2018 Upwork study, so it's likely more by now. But you know, when we actually dig in a little deeper and we look at what that is, we're talking about, you know, some of the types of remote work that we've seen spoken about so far, which is satellite workers, where there's a large contingent of people working on site, but with, you know, scattered workers who are often the minority. Some companies implement it in the form of remote days. And then like remote optionality. If you feel like working remote, you work remote, but otherwise you work at the office. And then other companies are a little bit more ambiguous. And you know, they'll call themselves remote friendly. And actually, Over's this way. You know, we talk about ourselves as being remote friendly, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've been trying to figure this out for ourselves. And so actually, you know, when we look at it, actually most companies that would call themselves remote are really just remote-ish. They're sort of remote. You know, the data bears this out. A recent study by Buffer, the state of remote, like out of all of the companies that call themselves remote, you know, only 31% are fully remote companies. And that's, and if you take a look at that even further, the biggest of these types of companies tend to be young companies. They tend to also have young co-founders. And so they're early stages. There's not a lot of data on them. And what's really interesting is that just more recently, there's been some real successes with these types of companies. But, you know, for the other 69% of us, the office factor is real. And this is, you know, this is something that really is makes remote working quite difficult, because, you know, many remote companies are still headquartered on the ground somewhere, physically located somewhere, and not so much in the cloud. And what really happens is that remote working becomes a way of working, right? The office is the center, and if you work remotely, you're kind of scattered, and you're outside of that. And it's very difficult to know what's happening in the office, and it's very difficult to access that. And maybe people working at the office would feel the same way about accessing what's happening outside of the office, or people who are not co-located. But really what this creates is it creates a situation where remote working is kind of a perk, but if you want to be close to the action, if you want to know what's happening, who's doing what, you need to be at the office. That means that remote-ish type work is hard. This has certainly been true. It's certainly been true of like my experience with remote working, especially in the early stages of figuring this out in any company where we've implemented it, is that it's really hard to find the balance between that, you know, catering and supporting remote work, but also creating a vibrant office space and having the best of both worlds. Interestingly enough, you know, this report that I think this was a report, also this was in the Buffer State of Remote Work report, you know, they spoke about how only 80% of people who work remotely get absolutely no financial support to do so. So, you know, you come into the office and there's so much support there. There's so much by way of just, you know, all kinds of things that we take for granted to help you do that. And yet, if you work remotely, if you choose, you know, to work remotely, you get no support whatsoever from the company. And if you look at how these companies work, operationally, companies that don't support remote work, really, other than to say that it's just, they'll let you do it. If you actually go and look at how many of them work, they're actually functionally indistinct from companies who don't do remote work. And what I mean by that is that if you look at how the day-to-day works, they're the same companies. One of them just, you can work remotely if you want. That's really tough. I mean, if you look at what's hard, right, it's things like communication. 27% of people who responded to, who partook in a FYI, a great new little startup who's doing a lot of work in this remote space. 27% of the people who said that, who work remotely spoke about communication being difficult, spoke about having lack of access to social opportunities. They complained about loneliness and isolation. A lot of The problem had to do with the human experience of being remote, right? And so what's happened is that a lot of these offices have gone and put, they've gone and put technology in place, but that's all they've done. They've literally, you know, subscribed to a couple of apps, and that's pretty much as far as it goes when it comes to remote working. And then, you know, it's no wonder that you have people feeling so isolated and alienated, especially when you consider that there's no financial support for doing so. So yeah, to be that guy, I think it's important to, you know, when you think about this hybrid model and having both remote people who are fully remote as well as having people who are co-located, you have to look at the why behind offices. You know, so, you know, what's with offices? So if you will indulge me for a moment, like there is a lot of value to having a physical location in whichever city or country that you find yourself operating in. There's a lot of value in it. And it's important to understand the value of this if you are a leader trying to harness and get the best of both worlds. You know, the first thing is just that you can't deny the fact that humans have a connection to physical places. And if you think about the effort that we put into creating office spaces, especially those of us who do both, we really try to create a place that's special and conducive to work. And then it's no wonder that people enjoy being there, right? And so there's this kind of we design great spaces and people want to be there. And we have human connection to spaces that are great to be in. And so that's a real factor. Offices are also communication superhighways. And I'm not talking about, you know, chat at the water cooler and that kind of thing. I'm talking about just being in the presence of other people. So much communication happens at offices in the office environment that you're not even aware of. And, you know, you can go into an office and put your head down and just work solid 8 hours. And you might not be aware of it, but you've learned so much. You've spoken so much with other people. So much has been said just by your interactions. Like often, you know, I'll be able to look up when I have gone into the office and I'll see, wow, the marketing team are definitely having a bad day today, right? And you can see that. I haven't spoken to anyone, but that's just the reality. There's also strategic value. You know, you might find that it's really important as a business strategy to actually be physically located in a space. This is something that's definitely been true of OVA. We have really wanted to be able to have meetups and invite people into our space and create a space where creative people are able to come and creators are able to come and reach out to that artistic community in Cape Town, certainly. And we've only just really started in London, but we could definitely see that as being something important into the future. There's also something to be said for the fact that offices, they're kind of like embodiments of our culture and our values, and this also can't be understated. You know, you walk into a place and it speaks to you. It tells you something about the company you work in. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of reasons why it's great to have offices, and that's not to say you have to have offices, but there's also great value to them. And so something that, you know, I've thought a lot about in just having worked in so many different companies and been in both the space of just going and working in a place that's been designed, and then also starting up new businesses and being a part of that designing space. There's this quote by Winston Churchill. That's the old dude down at the bottom of the slide. Who said, you know, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. And I think this is something that we don't think enough of. Offices codify culture. Now, what I mean by that is that the spaces that we're in, they actually create a lot of the work culture that we experience. And in startups and in a lot of companies, we don't have the time, we don't have the means, or sometimes we just don't actually have the people to really think deeply and articulate what our working culture is. That is, what are the agreements around how we work? And there's so much that's going to be said about this over the next 2 days that I won't dwell too much on that. But the point here is that often we don't get to that. And what happens is that the offices, the physical spaces, and the way they're designed and how things work in those spaces just creates our culture. And so you have this incidental culture that you didn't necessarily plan. You might have because you designed some of the spaces, but we're unaware of the fact and the degree to which our offices actually create our culture, especially if we don't take the initiative to drive that. And so if you think about the kinds of things that office culture and office first culture optimizes for, the first thing is availability. Anyone's there. You can just tap someone on the shoulder, right? The concept of the office, is optimized for that. And you also have to realize that, there's a lot of things about this idea of offices that we've just inherited from decades and decades of offices existing. But you think about meeting rooms, you think about water cooler moments, cafes that we create. There's a lot around just being able to be where it's assumed you're available. Offices also are heavily biased towards this this idea of oral tradition, where you want to know something, ask Jan or speak to Pete. And so you have this tradition where information and stories are passed orally, sort of like early society, right? And very little is written, and it's always about speaking to people. And there's also something about offices and how they are designed, and they are biased towards creating sort of a pedestrian culture. And what I mean by that is that you just walk around the office, you go to your meeting, you have these routines of places that you go to and walk to, and based on how you move within an office, you learn things. And so all of these things shape a culture that if you aren't on the forefront of shaping that culture yourself, and many companies aren't, especially early stage startups, your office culture becomes your culture, whether or not you've intended it to be or not. Now, if we go back and we look at those remote pains again, you realize that actually a lot of these issues are issues that you won't ever really have in an office. You'll always be able to talk, social opportunities happen, organic interaction happens as you walk from one meeting to another. And so what it means is that functionally, your office space is a band-aid for the fact that you actually have no functional culture, no explicit working culture. And this is where remote working breaks down, is that the culture is created on the fly and as it happens in the offices, and it emerges there. And as a remote worker, you are unable to partake in that experience. And so what happens is you have two separate experiences. And so when you have an office first culture, you really use this idea of having a whole bunch of people in one space as a blunt force instrument for just not needing to solve any of these problems. So that's quite a negative outlook. And so can being remote-ish work? As Drake is suggesting over here, no. I don't think it can, especially like this. As long as you work this way, your remote workers, your remote team members are always going to feel like second-class citizens. But if you take the idea and adopt the principles of being remote first, then like Drake, your remote workers will be very happy. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more. What this means is that you can't continue to be implicitly remote, as in, yes, it's a perk, you can do it, it's fine. This is how we expect you to behave when you work remotely. you need to become more explicitly remote. So you move from remote as a perk to the office as a perk. You move from sort of like remote being a thing that people can do to defaulting to remote. It's just what we found is that when we bias towards remote first principles, people who are co-located, like they are more than catered for. They tend to love the fact that they get to have more clarity, that they don't have to be in as many meetings, that it's okay to just not be available. We found that the more we have started doing this, the better the office environment has been, simply by being explicit around being remote first. What's important to understand here is that we're not saying that office workers are second-class citizens, but if you think about there's this idea that there's equality and equity, and the difference between those two concepts. And I should have actually had a picture for this, but actually, if you Google, if you do a Google image search and you type equality versus equity, you'll see a couple of like little cartoon diagrams that explain it really well. But the short version is that equality is that regardless of your strengths, everyone gets the same amount of support. Equity is that you understand that, you know, certain things need more support than others just because they're harder to make work. And so actually by remote first as a concept, remote first principles are largely about contracts and agreements and people. It kind of exists in the mind, and so it needs to be prioritized if it's going to be able to compete with you know, just culture that emerges out of offices. And the reason that you want to do this, and the reason for doing any of this really, is that you want to create a single shared work environment and experience for working. And you know that it's impossible to bring everyone into the office. Clearly that's not working. And so what you need to do is bring everyone into the cloud, as it were, and create the shared experience there with the perk of, you know, if you want to go to the office, awesome. But you don't have to. You can have a great experience working and feel like you aren't missing on anything, out on anything. So a way to do this is to think about your office as a technology stack. What I mean by this is that this, especially for those of us who've spent, you know, who've spent time and have invested in some way or form in building offices that either speak to our culture or enhance our working culture, is to look at our offices and go, well, these offices and the spaces in them are actually an interface. They're designed for jobs to be done, right? Using product language, that the spaces that we design, that might be like a set of chairs. Like it might be that, so for instance, in one of the office spaces that I designed for a previous company, we put a lot of like couches and really like what was the job to be done there? It was to create comfort around work when people were co-located. So how do you go, how do you take that and extrapolate it, right? How do you look at your office space and try to see what are the things about our office space that work really well for us, and how can we bring that, create some kind of equivalent in the cloud? Now, some of these things you can't do, and actually some of the stuff in the office you shouldn't try to replicate because it's actually bad. But it's important to just start that way, and to think about the fact that everything that, all the best parts of your office will have some kind of outcome that they were designed for. And then what you need to do is think about, like, how do we virtualize this stuff? How do we create equivalents in the cloud? So I'll share briefly just some of the things that some of these things that I'll share now are things that we're currently doing. And some of these are things that we are starting to do or wanting to do in the near future, because over the last 2 years, we've grown significantly, and we found that being implicitly remote and just kind of letting it happen has been fine for some people, but there are definitely people who've gotten lost in that. There are definitely people who have felt like they've missed out on a lot, and it's been appealing to some people, but not really appealing to others. And we have an incredible office space, and what we've been trying to do, and what we've realized as we've hired more people who are further out and distributed across different time zones, is that we actually have to create an incredible virtual experience of working at Over, where offices are optional. So the one thing that's obvious is that, you know, we're moving from like physical to virtual. Now, this is the example that I'll use here is mostly just around like meetings. One thing we did recently was we said that every single meeting is remote by default. So what that means is that we have a lot of meetings where everyone's actually in the office, but they'll do the meeting over Zoom. And again, unless it's like explicitly stated that it's face-to-face, the assumption is it's remote. You'll dial in. There's never we've moved away from this idea of like, are you in the office? Another thing, another area where this has come to life for us is doing work conferences. This is a video I shared recently. This is our company doing like a conference and workshop. This was a 2-day workshop. Every single person in our company did it. We did it all at the same time, and we had everyone like working together. This was to create a new set of values, and because we're a visual company, everyone made things that were really visual. And the point here is that we took something that would be that you would normally bring everyone, fly everyone over, and we made it a virtual experience. Now, obviously, those flying everyone in is great, but you can create really meaningful virtual experiences like this, where the teams get to break away, work together, come back together, share ideas and thinking, and it's all done remotely across like a number of different time zones. Which brings us to, you know, I've shown you an example of us doing everything in real time, but wherever possible, we prefer and we're trying to steer people to doing work that is asynchronous. Now, traditionally speaking, asynchronous has meant you're going to have to read long docs, right? But that's changing a lot with the advent of tools like Loom, which is a tool that we use a lot in the office, where you create a screen recording with your face and you talk through something, you do a demo, you explain something, you give feedback, and you just post that into a channel and people read it and pick it up as and when they want to. So, you know, with voice notes and written docs and video docs, you can have, especially for lightweight conversation, you're able to do that asynchronously. Obviously, the real thing that you want to get, the real like value that you want to entrench with asynchronous work is this idea of learning how to write and make your ideas and your thinking timeless and accessible by anyone at any time. So this is something that I would put in this is something we're moving towards, and we're starting to need it more now as the overlap between our time zones is getting to like the state where we have maybe 2 or 3 hours with some of our employees. Another important thing is switching from a cultural perspective. When you're in an office and you have like an office first culture, you are constantly pulling information from people, and that is kind of the norm and the expected. What we try and do is we are really trying to like teach our people to push context constantly. So this is a really important thing that I can say that if you are a remote worker, you should be constantly pushing what you're doing, giving people access to your mind, not just to your output. This is really important to do. Another thing that we're doing is, the problem with deliverables, and I remember reading earlier, someone was talking about deliverables and liking to be, just wanting to be alone and, left with a set of deliverables. There's high risk with that, right? Being left alone to just get something done, especially when it's a sizable piece of work. It's high risk for a business to just wait and see. And so one of the things we're doing is really prioritizing this idea of emergent work, where it's like from the earliest stages, and this is kind of related to this idea of pushing context. From the earliest stages, you are sharing your thinking around your work. So we have tools called the problem frame, where we encourage people whenever they're thinking about work to share their understanding of the problem before they start to get into the solution space. Just two examples of like how we're doing that at the moment. On the left-hand side, you can see in Miro, we all worked as a company on our 2020 OKRs and our Q1 OKRs. And everyone did this a mixture of synchronously and asynchronously. And this was literally like having a giant whiteboard, and people were pasting sticky notes as and when they had ideas or thoughts or wanted to put things down. And so we encourage people to not just put finished work out in the open, but to put any work that they're doing out in the open, and to make this all accessible, not just to stakeholders, but to anyone who might be interested. A big thing that we've had to learn as we've started prioritizing remote first is changing how we think about managing people and really looking for self-motivated people. And this obviously has changed the way that we recruit people, but it's also got a lot to do with the kinds of qualities that we look for in people who work. I think it's really important to note that remote working is definitely not for everyone. If you feel like you need to, if you're the kind of person that needs to have someone pushing you along to get to a deadline, at best you're going to survive as a remote worker. You're really going to struggle to kind of grow. We really look for people who have an air of self-motivation. And this has got nothing to do with seniority. This has got to do with like wanting to learn and taking charge of your own personal development. That doesn't mean that managers aren't important. It just means that managers really just help take you to the next level, as opposed to managing your workload and your workflow. Super important, and I think this might be my last one, is just office spaces and working in the office really is a spontaneous environment. And when you move to a remote first culture, you have to be intentional about everything. And one of the things we've done is that, in order to make sure that everyone has the same experience, we've been very intentional about any perks that come by way of you being in the office. So for instance, we've done, we've had physiotherapists, as well as haircuts and grooming in the office. Any of those benefits we've made available to remote workers as well. And this is something important. You might not have a lot of benefits, but if you give some, if being at the office means you get to experience something, make sure that that is something that everyone gets to experience. So I think what I've been getting at is that, with so many people experiencing remote work in a situation and environment, 69% of us, right, where there's office and remote. For those of us who are leaders, for those of us who are designing the environments in which our employees work, is to avoid this idea of remote people remote being the perk, remote being the other way or a way to work. Because this really makes it difficult for people to have a shared experience. You know, as long as you have an office first mentality and approach to work, you at best are going to have people who are just getting through the work. You're going to struggle to nurture and develop people and retain people longer term for reasons, you know, beyond just creature comforts. But if you become remote first, if you become explicit around defaulting towards remotes, even in your office environments, what happens there is that you create a company that exists as a set of ideas, agreements. You have a shared experience that you're able to export anywhere in the world. And that is a far more powerful and a far more scalable way of working.